Hello, everyone. It's good to see you all. Thank you for joining us this evening for a little Bible study. Tonight, we are looking at the topic of does science disprove religion? And I got to admit that I am way out of my depth when it comes to science. I am the son of an engineer. I am the grandson of an engineer. Both guys working to put people and things in space. But my scientific knowledge topped out at chemistry in high school and pre-cal with algebra. That was as far as I made it before I said, look, history, books, that's more of my lane. So this has been an interesting lesson to study for. It has had lots of me looking words up in the dictionary and things like that. But my goal tonight is not to be overly technical. If you are not of a scientific disposition, trust this will be beneficial for you. Usually, if you are regular joining us on Wednesday nights, you know that our typical Bible study time involves sort of digging into a passage of Scripture and sort of flipping it inside out and seeking to understand it. So tonight's going to be a little bit different. It's a little bit more of a history, philosophy, and theology lecture, but it does pertain to our use of the Bible, and the way it pertains to our use of the Bible is vitally important. So I trust it'll be beneficial. I'm going to do my best not to be boring. If that sounds like setting you up for a snoozer, I promise you it's not. I just want you to understand tonight's a little bit different. So the question is, does science disprove religion? So the assertion that's often made by those who are of sort of the atheist crowd is that science and the knowledge that has come with scientific discovery has sort of rendered religious belief obsolete and unneeded, that science has disproved religion. And it won't surprise you because you are here in this video. But the answer to that is no. And I trust when we get to be on the back end of this lecture, we will see that is in fact true, that science does not disprove religion. So there's several reasons for this, and here's going to be the format. We're going to have a brief history lesson. We're going to look at the different types of knowledge that science and religion are concerned with, and we're going to look at two potential areas of conflict. So some of the hot button things that come up in this discussion as it relates to the actual text of the Bible, we're going to dig into a little bit. So first, a brief history lesson of this conflict. Usually when people talk about it, Galileo comes up pretty quickly. So the idea that the conflict between religion and science really comes about when Galileo is on the scene. He is, if you don't know who Galileo is, he was an astronomer that lived in the late 15 and early 1600s. And he is, along with Nicholas Copernicus, the reason that we understand that the earth revolves around the sun. The sun does not revolve around the earth. So before Galileo and Copernicus, the prevailing view supported by the church was that the earth was the center of the universe. We call this a geocentric universe, geo meaning earth, and everything revolved around it. But in 1616, Galileo had published a book, and the church warned him not to teach what's called heliocentrism. So the idea that the universe, or not the universe, but the earth revolves around the sun. In 1616, the Roman Catholic Church, because remember this is after the Protestant Reformation, they tell him, listen, Galileo, cut it out. No teaching of the sun being the center. And they banned Nicholas Copernicus's book on the revolutions of the celestial spheres. They banned that in the same sort of meeting. And so the Roman Catholic Church was firmly entrenched. The earth is the center of the universe. We're not going to allow the sun to be taught as the center of the universe. So 16 years pass, and in 1632, Galileo publishes another fascinatingly titled book called Dialogue on the Two World Systems. I know people's ability to title books back then was just absolutely breathtaking. But this was a dialogue. He pitched the book. Within the book, it's couched as a dialogue between people about the organization of the solar system, whether or not the Earth or the sun is at the center. And when he read it, Pope Urban VIII ordered an investigation into Galileo's theology. In 1633, so a year later, Galileo was actually formally charged with being strongly suspected of being a heretic. They didn't convict him of heresy, but they said they were strongly suspicious of him being a heretic. And so this is how we now are often brought to understand that science and religion are in conflict. That was sort of the start of the whole controversy. And since then, science and religion have been in conflict. The reality actually is much more complicated than it's often presented. So there's a few things that you should know. And having a historian and a nerd as a pastor, I'm delighted to bring these to you. First of all, this has to do with the Protestant Reformation. So the Protestant Reformation in 1515, when the, what we now know as the Protestant church split off from the Roman Catholic Church, one of the emphases that Martin Luther had and the Protestant Reformation had was that the Bible was something that people should have access to. That the mass, that the church service should not be in a language that they can't understand. And that's the reason that when you attend services at Concord Baptist Church, I preach in English, we sing in English. We don't do it in Latin or in Greek or in Hebrew. This is a result of the Protestant Reformation. And as you would imagine, after such a major split, the Catholic Church is pretty sensitive to anything that smacks of Protestantism. And what Galileo was saying as a layperson, so Galileo is not a priest. He's not a member of the clergy. He's a layperson, and he is claiming to teach theological truth. He's claiming to argue that the church's version of the solar system has been wrong. So that makes them profoundly uncomfortable. Laymen making theological arguments. That's something that's not done in the Catholic Church. They're not certified. And so that smacks of Protestantism. That's sort of what put him on their radar. And he actually made the argument. He said, listen, scriptures writers, biblical authors, they wrote in language that their readers could understand. So why shouldn't we? So you would imagine that didn't go over well. So there's a politically motivated reason for prosecuting Galileo outside of the fact that he's arguing for a different view of the solar system. The other reason that they go after Galileo so hard has to do with the way that he makes his argument. So yeah, I told you that his book in 1632 was a dialogue. And so what he did, and what often writers did who wrote those kinds of books, is they would put the arguments of certain people into the characters' dialogue in the book. And so Galileo takes Urban VIII's arguments about the solar system, and he puts them into a character named Simplicio's mouth. So Simplicio in this book is the one who sort of speaks out Urban's arguments. And Simplicio in all of the book is always on the losing side of the argument. So if you're the Pope reading this, basically you are reading the character that is reading your arguments as the one who's always losing the arguments, which you can imagine, given human pride, that's fairly insulting. So this whole conflict between Galileo and the Catholic Church isn't primarily theological. It's actually political and has to do with the ways that he's making his arguments. So that's usually where this discussion starts about science and religion. It's helpful to have a little context that even the beginning of the discussion can be misguided. But even more importantly than that, the reality that science exists is actually due to Christians. So when we were in elementary and middle school, we were taught the scientific method. The scientific method is pioneered by two Christians, Roger Bacon and William of Ockham. They laid the basis for the scientific method, and its popularization, the reason that you and I know it today, is due to another Christian named Francis Bacon. And I know that's two Bacons in science history, which is probably a good reason to study science because Bacon is good. But Francis Bacon is the one who popularizes empirical investigation in the scientific method. And he says this in an essay on atheism. He says, "It's true that a little philosophy inclineth a man's mind to atheism." So if you study a little bit, you may end up being an atheist. But depth in philosophy bringeth men's mind about to religion. So according to Bacon, deep diving into philosophy and science actually has the effect of bringing people to religion. So science doesn't disprove religion, it actually leads to it. And this has been the history of science and the church. Christianity has always prized the life of the mind and study. Christians have been bookish, studious people. In fact, the origins of many of our modern universities, whether it be Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, or Yale, they were all created as religious universities, as places to train people and pastors in religion. Science has always been, and it has had a long history of being a form of worship for Christians. So science, and specifically exploration into the natural world, has been a way that Christians have sought to worship the God of the universe by exploring his creation. Rational study of a universe created by a rational God. So contrary to the idea that religion is disproved by science, religion has often been the chief motivator for scientific exploration and discovery. And you see that all throughout scientific history. The history of science is saturated with Christians. And even people who are not Christian, but religious, who believe in a deity. So now it's time for a story about Albert Einstein. So Einstein was not a Christian, but this story is actually about his study. So on his wall in his study, he kept pictures of three of his scientific heroes: Isaac Newton, Michael Faraday, and James Clerk Maxwell. I'm going to tell you a little bit about those guys, but I would just point out that you don't put something in your study unless it is deeply meaningful and influential to you. So if you sit in my office, you'll not only see books, but you'll see things on the walls, you'll see things on the shelves, things that I've brought back from other countries, pictures of people who are special to me, pictures of theologians who have deeply influenced me. They're there for a reason because they've been influential in my life. And it's the same thing with Albert Einstein. He has pictures of Isaac Newton, Michael Faraday, and Maxwell. So Isaac Newton, we know him for discovering gravity, but he was not an orthodox believer. He denied the divinity of Christ, but he was a deeply persuaded believer in God. In fact, he actually wrote more theology than he did physics. Same thing with Faraday. Michael Faraday actually was an Orthodox Christian. We know him for his study of electromagnetism. He's considered one of the greatest experimental scientists of all times. He wrote tons on the relationship between science and faith. And then James Clerk Maxwell, the third hero of Einstein, was actually an elder in the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. Like, this is the man who is known for the second great unification of physics, uniting electricity, magnetism, and light. And I don't know what all that means, but I know it's important in science history. And the point is, these guys lived on the wall in Einstein's study, and they were all believers in God. So this narrative that science actually disproves Christianity, disproves faith in general, is deeply misguided. It's disproved by history. In fact, and I'm not going to go into detail. If you want more names, you can read the book that I've been referencing by Rebecca McLaughlin, Confronting Christianity. But men like Lord Kelvin, George Mendel, Asa Gray, who's Darwin's closest collaborator, Paul Shellard, who's Stephen Hawking's closest collaborator, all of these men are not only believers in God, but they're Christians. We have a whole measurement system named after Lord Kelvin. He is a believer. And today, the field of science is saturated by Christians, including a recent president of MIT, sort of the holy grail university of science. So it's important that we understand that this argument that science has disproved religion is false based on history. If that were true, there would be no Christian scientists. And in fact, there are tons. But we can name names all day. So why is it that these scientists don't see a conflict between their faith and science? This has to do with the nature of the types of knowledge that science and religion pursue. So science is concerned with what is. It's concerned with factual information, observable information. Religion is concerned with a connected but different type of knowledge. It's concerned with why. So science is concerned with what is. Religion is concerned with why what is. One of the hardest realities for pure secularists, guys like Richard Dawkins, to deal with is the existence of what we might call metaphysical realities and morality in general. So in other words, things that are real, that exist, but can't be quantified and measured. Love, for instance. Things that science does not have a reason for, but nonetheless exist. In fact, Richard Dawkins, who is a pure evolutionist and that kind of guy, says that when it comes to science, he is a passionate Darwinian. So somebody who believes that, survival of the fittest, that things are purely naturalistic. We are sort of, big bags of atoms and molecules and really nothing more. So when it comes to science, he is a passionate Darwinian. But when it comes to politics, and this is a direct quote from him, and how we should conduct human affairs, he is a passionate anti-Darwinian. So even sort of amongst one of the four horsemen of pure secularism today, we hear that there is a conflict, even within himself. That when it comes to how things are, he's good with a purely naturalistic view of the world. But when it comes to the way we relate to others, politics, and how we should treat others, he recognizes you cannot be purely secular, because what that leads to is really scary. So let's talk about that for a second. What Dawkins is getting at in that quote that's sort of contradictory is He's fine with things being pure chance, solely consisting of atoms and molecules, but you can't drag that logic into the world of human relationships, because then you could justify anything. If all we are is naturalistic, if there is nothing else underlying it, then there is no reason to object to things like murder and rape and genocide. If there's no God who is given no moral code, who is no judge over all of us, then who is to say that those things are wrong? You might can make an argument, and some have, that murder and rape and genocide are all wrong because they're harmful for society. So they're not working for the greatest good. But none of us view murder as wrong simply because it's bad for society. None of us would listen to an account of a rape and say that that's bad because it's bad for society. We recognize those things are evil and wicked in their own right. We actually use the word immoral. It is against morality. We recognize that implicitly as a knee-jerk reaction within us. There is a deeper reality than simply what we see. Ingrained within us is sort of this knowledge that there is something that is deeper than what is purely observable. So for instance, and at this point, if you're asleep, you may be wishing that I do this, but if I were to go up to a tall building and jump off a ledge, and that were to be reported on the news, science could tell you the height of the jump. It could tell you the wind conditions. It could tell you the effect that such a jump would have on my body, but it would not tell you why I did that. And when it's reported on the news, no news story is going to simply give you the statistics of the fall. It is going to pursue what we want most to know, which is, why would this person do something? McLaughlin says discovering the how of something can be important. Knowing how someone died, so the mechanics of it, the science of it, doesn't exhaust the story. Just like notes for the left and the right hand on piano music are equally important, the measurable, so the scientific data, and the meaning are not fighting for position. Both are needed to give a full picture. And this is what we see all through history with science and religion, science and faith. They work hand in hand. Science is concerned with what is, and it's perfectly compatible with faith and religion, which is concerned with why things are. 95% of the relationship between science and religion falls into this category. Science discovers God's world, and religion gives that discovery significance. In fact, science would have very little significance apart from knowing that we live in a world created by an omnipotent creator that gives scientific discovery significance. All right, I can hear some of you saying, okay, so what about when scientific discovery contradicts religious teaching? And now we're getting into the Bible. So we're going to deal with sort of the two big ones, and I am not for a moment claiming that this is going to exhaust this whole debate. There are libraries full of books that would speak with much more clarity than I can in this brief little study to these issues. And I would encourage you to check them out. I'm going to mention a few of them at the end. But two big ones, miracles and the creation account. So miracles is one of the first things that tends to come up. Doesn't science disprove the reality of miracles? But that actually misunderstands scientific knowledge altogether. Science can only prove the probability of something. It cannot prove it 100%. So the turning of water into wine, the resurrection from the dead, these are things that seem to be impossible because in our experience, according to the scientific data, they do not happen. So scientifically, death is an irreversible condition. Remember, science is concerned with what is. A miracle, by definition, is the opposite of what is normally. It is an impossibility made real. So science at best can only say that usually does not happen. It's not in a position to say that can never happen. Everyone in the first century believed that a resurrection from the dead was an unusual, impossible event. That's why it's such a big deal. So to say that the laws of nature are not usually violated is not actually incompatible with our faith. It accords with our faith. Science actually proves the miraculous nature of miracles. It doesn't disprove them. It can't disprove them. It can only say that they don't usually happen. And that's kind of the whole point. So even the account of miracles in Scripture are not contrary to science. In fact, science proves that they are in fact miraculous. Second, creation of the universe. So when it comes to Genesis 1 through 3, Now, this is why last week we covered how we deal with the Bible, how we take it literally, what it means to take the Bible seriously, because that question affects this debate. So much of the problem with the conversation around Genesis 1 through 3 relates to that discussion. Last week, if you didn't tune in, you can find it on the YouTube channel. But we talked about how important it is when we read Scripture to ask what the genre of literature we're reading is, and to ask the author's intention so that we interpret it correctly. And an example that was given is Proverbs are general truths about life. They are not meant to be understood as laws that happen 100% of the time. Rather, they are describing what usually is. And so we said, train up a child in the way he should go. When he is old, he will not depart from it. That is usually true, right? Usually, children who are trained to live a certain way, they prove that they continue on in that way. Does that happen 100% of the time? No. So understanding the genre of Proverbs helps us understand that. Understanding the genre of prophecy, which can be a very vague, highly symbolic genre of literature, will help us from making dumb mistakes. So this is a really important thing. Genesis 1 through 3 is one of those areas of Scripture where this genre is not necessarily clear. It's not clear whether this is a big summary, whether this is a blow-by-blow history. It's not exactly clear what is going on in Genesis 1 through 3 in terms of how it's supposed to be specifically interpreted. That does not mean that we can't know what Genesis 1 through 3 means. Now, if you need a term, Genesis 1 through 3 is making a theological point. So Genesis 1 through 3, even though we're not exactly sure, people argue whether or not it's 100% literal, and those are 24-hour days, or whether they are ages. That's all up in the air. What's not up in the air is the point of Genesis 1 through 3, what it's trying to get across. It is communicating a very clear truth that we live in a universe that was created by God, who is a creator, that we as human beings are made in his image. The universe tells the story of his power and his glory, and that mankind is the crowning creation amid all the creation. So Genesis 1 through 3 is structured to communicate these theological truths. It is not, nor does it purport to be, a scientific treatise. If God wanted us to understand precisely with 100% clarity how it was that things came to be, he could have written out the genetic code for everything that he created. He could have described in the most minute detail how exactly all this happened, but he chose not to do that. Instead, he gave us Genesis 1 through 3 that communicates these big truths about who he is. He created the universe. Out of the breath of his mouth, everything was formed. The universe has a starting point, which actually accords pretty well with the scientific data. Until the late 1900s, the concept of time in the universe was something called the steady state theory, that the universe is eternal. It has always existed. It has always maintained sort of a steady state. Advances in astronomy and mathematics brought about what we know as the Big Bang theory, and that is now the most widely held view of the origin of the universe. There was nothing, there was a Big Bang, and then there was something. And scientists, especially in the 1970s, atheistic scientists, really didn't like the Big Bang theory because it accords really well with Genesis 1. The universe has a starting point. There was nothing, and then there was everything. In fact, modern science points to the meta big point of Genesis being correct. Our existence is not by accident. In fact, there's several books that have been published by atheistic scientists who have talked about just the sheer probability of things working out for the universe to be able to sustain life. There's one number, it's called N. It's 1 to 36 zeros. So a 1 with 36 zeros after it. And it describes the electrical force that's needed to hold atoms together. And if you're off by even a fraction, there's no stars, there's no earth, and there's no life. And Martin Rees, who's an atheistic scientist, says there's really three options to explain how we get a universe with such highly specific life conditions. Number one is pure chance. Number two is that there was a creator who created it specifically to be this way. And number three is that there are multiple parallel universes. So there are an infinite number of parallel universes, all with different sort of random numbers. And ours happens to be the one that's perfect for life. And the way he evaluates these is he says, the idea of it being pure chance is just ridiculous. That's not possible. He dismisses that one out of hand. And the idea that this was a universe that was created by God is he rejects it as not plausible either. He opts for the third option, that there are an infinite number of parallel universes, and ours happens to be the one that sustains life. And I'm going to refer to Rebecca McLaughlin here because I think this is a beautiful quote. She says, "The idea of a creator God does not sound quite so crazy when you realize that the best current alternative explanation for the apparent fine-tuning of our universe for life is the existence of an infinite number of parallel universes." The idea of a creator God doesn't seem so ridiculous after that. And we see that this is true, that science and faith, science and religion are not mutually exclusive. In fact, for thousands of scientists around the world and down through history, they are quite compatible. So I hope this is an encouragement to you. I want to leave you with one more wonderful quote. This is from a Nobel Prize winning physicist named William Phillips, who is also an avid and passionate Christian. He says, describing his study in physics and what he sees in the world around him, "I see an orderly, beautiful universe in which nearly all the physical phenomena can be understood from a few simple mathematical equations. I see a universe that, had it been constructed slightly differently, would never have given birth to stars and to planets, let alone bacteria and people. And there is no good specific reason for why the universe should not have been different. Many good scientists have concluded from these observations that an intelligent God must have chosen to create the universe with such beautiful, simple, and life-giving properties. Many other equally good scientists are nevertheless atheists. Both conclusions are positions of faith." He's right. So I hope this has been encouraging to you. I hope you see that the takeaway for us as it relates to Bible study is that, as Augustine said, the way we interpret Scripture really matters, and our faithfulness to it, to take it seriously, matters. Because if we don't take it seriously, if we take everything flat out to be literally, then we end up asking things of Scripture that Scripture is not trying to do. And we end up abusing Scripture, actually, and looking foolish in the process. Just one closing example for that would be guys like Charles Taze Russell, the founder of the movement that has become known as the Jehovah's Witnesses, and Harold Camping, who we know of because of his world-ending predictions in 2011. Both of these men abused specifically the genre of prophecy to try to make it do something that it was not intended to do, to nail down a specific date for the return of Christ, and both were found to be foolish. And Augustine actually warned his peers early on in Christian history against doing that. And so should we follow that example. I want you to know that I'm praying for you. Thank you for joining us. We will meet again on Sunday morning at 7 a.m. Eastern Time. I just have one announcement. I'm going to announce it again on Sunday. But next week, we are going to probably be receiving some guidelines again from our governor. But as of right now, our plan as a church is that we will not be meeting at least through the first week in May as we sort of hear these guidelines and sort of try to chart a path forward. So that's the plan. You'll be getting an email on Monday with that and a few other things. But we are not planning on meeting through the first week in May. And that's as far out as we have planned right now. Thank you so much again for your patience, for all the encouraging notes. I am blessed beyond measure to get to be your pastor. And I look forward to being able to meet again with you face to face soon. I hope you have a wonderful evening. God bless you.